So usually when we talk about numbers, there's a built-in expectation of precision, you know.
Right, like they're absolute.
Exactly. I mean, if you're looking at engineering specs or an accounting ledger or even just checking your bank statement on your phone,
The number's just right there in black and white.
yeah, it just is what it is. $5 is $5. You don't argue with it, and it definitely doesn't try to manipulate you.
Because it's a representation of objective reality,
Yeah.
right? The math itself doesn't have an agenda.
Right. But then, you step into the world of modern conflict. You step into the theater of war,
And that all changes entirely.
completely thrown out the window. Suddenly, we're looking at a landscape of data that is uh, entirely malleable.
Oh, absolutely.
It's a landscape where those numbers flashing on your screen, the casualty counts, the statistics of destruction, they might have very little to do with actual physical reality.
But they have absolutely everything to do with how someone, somewhere, wants you to feel.
Exactly. So today we're taking a deep dive into a truly fascinating piece of source material. It's this document titled An AI PSYOP Analysis Test, and it specifically looks at the sensationalization of conflict data.
Yeah, it's essentially a total teardown of the machinery of information warfare.
It really is.
But, before we really get into the analysis itself, it's probably worth defining what we actually mean by a PSYOP in this context.
That's a good point. We hear that term thrown around a lot.
Right. Usually it's just as a casual buzzword, like, oh, that's a PSYOP. But a psychological operation isn't just standard public relations or run-of-the-mill political scheme.
No, it's much heavier than that.
Historically, a PSYOP is a highly coordinated military-grade effort. It's designed to convey selected information or sometimes outright deception to audiences.
To influence them?
Exactly, to influence their emotions, their motives, their objective reasoning, and ultimately the behavior of governments, organizations, and individuals.
So we are talking about moving way past, like, dropping propaganda leaflets out of airplanes in World War II.
Oh yeah, today we're utilizing algorithmic mass-scale cognitive manipulation.
Which is terrifying, honestly. And the author of this text set out to explore how the scale of war casualties, specifically regarding the ongoing conflicts involving the U.S., Israel, Iran, and Lebanon, is portrayed through that exact lens.
The lens of psychological operation.
Right. But listen, before we go one single step further into this, I need to set a really firm boundary for us here.
Absolutely necessary.
The source material references highly sensitive, ongoing, real-world conflicts. It specifically names nations, the United States, Israel, Iran, Lebanon. And it names specific political figures, notably Donald Trump.
Right.
So I want to state clearly and unequivocally to you listening right now that in our discussion today, we are not taking sides.
Not at all.
We are not endorsing the political viewpoints of the author of this text, and we are absolutely not validating or invalidating the specific claims made about these nations, their militaries, or these political leaders.
Because our focus here is strictly analytical.
Ex-
We're looking at the underlying mechanics of the argument and the cognitive vulnerabilities the text actually identifies.
Precisely. We are here to impartially unpack the ideas about information warfare. We're examining the logical framework exactly as it was presented in the source text.
Basically looking under the hood of how human perception is engineered.
Because the core theme here is incredibly compelling. In modern conflict, why does the perception of scale often matter far more than the raw numbers themselves?
It's a huge question.
Okay, let's unpack this. I want you to think about the last time you watched war coverage on the news or, scrolled past a geopolitical update on your feed.
Right.
Did you ever stop to question the numbers on the screen?
Most people don't.
Did you ever wonder if the scale of the destruction being reported was an objective fact or just a carefully curated narrative designed to trigger a specific cognitive response?
I mean, it's deeply uncomfortable to even ask that, right?
Yeah, it really is.
Because we rely on these institutions to map the world for us. When a tragedy of war is reported, the default human assumption is that we are being given the unvarnished truth.
Or at least an earnest attempt at the truth.
Exactly.
Well, the author of our source text starts off by throwing a massive wrench into that baseline assumption.
They really do.
Before we even get to the core of the AI analysis, we have to establish the author's initial premise, which revolves around this staggering discrepancy in how we, as humans, process scale and tragedy.
Right. The text points out that if you listen to political leaders and pundits across the entire spectrum, so mainstream media, alternative news sources, social media algorithms.
Pretty much everywhere.
Yeah, everywhere. The overwhelming impression communicated to the public is that Iran and Lebanon have suffered, quote, massively catastrophic losses.
And that phrasing, massively catastrophic, is doing a lot of heavy lifting there.
Oh, absolutely. From a linguistic standpoint, it implies an almost apocalyptic level of destruction.
It really paints a mental picture, doesn't it?
It does. It makes you envision entire regions just leveled, infrastructure totally erased, and casualties ranging into the hundreds of thousands.
Right. It signals an existential erasure.
Exactly. But then the text provides the estimated reality over a specific 40-day period of this conflict.
And the numbers are very different.
Very. The estimated deaths during that time frame were approximately 3,000 in Iran and a comparable number in Lebanon.
Now, obviously, the author is careful to state that these tragic losses of life are not to be trivialized.
No, of course not.
Yeah.
Every single life lost in a conflict is a profound tragedy.
But they are asking us to look at this from a macro perspective, right? To determine, relativistically, how objectively catastrophic these numbers actually are on a global scale.
Right. What's fascinating here is how the author contextualizes that. They bring in a comparison that really forces a cognitive reset.
It's jarring.
It is. They compare this 40-day toll of roughly 6,000 combined conflict deaths to an ongoing daily tragedy that gets virtually zero media coverage.
Which is wild to think about.
According to the text, about 20,000 children under the age of 5 lose their lives every single day from preventable poverty-related causes.
Okay, I mean, let's just sit with the raw math of that for a second.
It's hard to even process.
20,000 children a day. That equates to 140,000 every single week.
Wow.
It's roughly 600,000 a month. And it is over 7 million children every single year. 7 million.
That's a staggering figure.
And yet, the political and media apparatus paints a picture of the regional conflict that leads the global public to believe those specific war losses are the dominant catastrophic threat to human life.
Dominating the entire global conversation.
Right, while 7 million children are effectively invisible.
It really forces us to examine how the human brain processes what we might call relativistic versus objective catastrophe.
Break that down a little bit.
Sure. So objectively, statistically,
Huh.
7 million preventable deaths a year is a catastrophe of incomprehensible proportions.
Yeah.
It dwarfs the casualties of almost any modern regional conflict. But our society normalizes systemic, massive daily death when it comes to poverty.
We just tune it out.
We categorize it cognitively as an unfortunate background condition of the world. It's static.
Right.
War, on the other hand, is dynamic. We fixate on targeted, localized death because it represents a sudden rupture in the status quo.
It's like a biological glitch in how we perceive threats, you know?
How so?
Well, we are essentially dealing with a sensory bottleneck in the human brain. Think about how a computer's RAM gets completely overwhelmed if you run a massive high-priority emergency program.
Right. Everything else slows down.
Exactly. It has to pause all the background processing just to deal with the immediate spike in demand. War acts as that high decibel alarm. It floods our cognitive RAM.
The suddenness, the violence, the
Right,
noise.
yeah. It creates this sensory bottleneck where we simply cannot process the slow, quiet, chronic disaster of global poverty.
Even though the body count is exponentially higher.
Right. It's like a localized dramatic storm getting 24/7 breaking news coverage, while a slow-moving global climate shift that affects millions more goes entirely ignored.
That's a great analogy. And that sensory bottleneck is deeply rooted in evolutionary psychology.
Like survival instincts.
Exactly. Humans evolved to react instantly to sudden, immediate threats. You know, the proverbial saber-toothed tiger jumping out of the brush.
Right. You don't have time to think about long-term problems.
No. We are hyper-tuned to sudden movements and loud noises because those dictated immediate survival. We are not evolved to comprehend slow-moving, systemic, dispersed threats.
So poverty is a slow famine.
And war is the tiger.
Right.
Our neurological wiring basically ensures the tiger gets 100% of our attention, regardless of the statistical reality of the danger.
Okay, I do want to push back a little on the source materials framing here, though.
Sure, let's hear it.
We are asking you to think critically, so we have to do the same with the text. Is it actually an apples-to-apples comparison for the author to weigh war casualties directly against global poverty deaths?
It's a fair question.
I mean, a death is a death, certainly. But war is a sudden active conflict driven by deliberate human agency.
The intent is there.
Exactly. It involves a hostile actor consciously pulling a trigger or launching a missile with the intent to destroy.
Right.
Poverty, while terrible, is largely a chronic systemic failure. It doesn't usually have an immediate, identifiable villain executing a conscious strategy of
Yes,
violence.
very true.
So doesn't that fundamental difference in intentionality justify why human beings pay disproportionate attention to war?
I think the intention behind the violence matters immensely in human psychology. You're right.
It has to, right?
Yeah. When a death is the result of deliberate hostile action by an enemy state, it triggers our threat response mechanisms in a way that starvation in a distant country simply does not.
Because the enemy state is actively trying to hurt us.
Exactly. An enemy state represents an active, adaptable, ongoing threat that could, theoretically, escalate and threaten our own physical safety.
Right. Poverty isn't plotting against us.
No, a systemic failure like poverty does not adapt and plan attacks against us.
Okay, so the author's comparison might be a bit flawed there.
Well, the author's underlying point seems to be less about demanding equal airtime for poverty and more about highlighting the profound vulnerability in our perception of scale.
Meaning?
If our cognitive filters can be so easily overwhelmed by the tiger that we become completely blind to 7 million objective deaths, it proves how incredibly malleable our outrage is.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I see that.
And if our outrage is malleable, it can be engineered.
Which brings us perfectly to the core experiment of the source text.
Right.
The author establishes this massive gap between statistical reality, the 3,000 deaths, and the public perception of hundreds of thousands of deaths.
Engineered outrage.
Exactly. They want to know the mechanics of why this exaggeration occurs. But they ran into a roadblock.
They realized they couldn't trust humans to answer it.
Right. They realized they couldn't trust human pundits or traditional geopolitical analysts to explain it objectively.
And the text notes there is a glaring absence of media self-reflection on this.
Nobody wants to call themselves out.
Exactly. Traditional media rarely, if ever, covers its own structural role in sensationalizing war. Nor do politicians explain the psychological utility of their own exaggerations.
So to get around this human blind spot, the author took a really novel approach.
They fed the entire premise into an AI model.
Specifically, Grok 4. They prompted the AI to break down the mechanics of these PSYOP sensationalizations.
And the constraint they put on the AI is the most critical part of the experiment.
Yeah, tell me about the prompt.
The prompt forced the AI to rely exclusively on basic logic and first principles reasoning about war psychology, power dynamics, and incentives.
Meaning it couldn't just regurgitate news articles.
Right. It explicitly ordered the AI to ignore human consensus, to disregard external sources or conventional media wisdom, and to bypass any historical bias or partisan talking points.
Analyzing geopolitical strategy through the lens of a restricted AI model is a fascinating exercise.
It really is an epistemological experiment. The author is attempting to strip away the emotional investment, the nationalistic pride, and the institutional echo chambers that human analysts inevitably fall into.
Because humans are basically hardwired to be biased about war.
Exactly. A human pundit analyzing a conflict is always, on some level, burdened by their own nationality, their network's editorial slant, their audience's expectations, or their own political ideology.
But the AI doesn't have a nationality.
Right. The AI is directed to treat human conflict coldly. It views the battlefield merely as a system of inputs, incentives, and outputs.
Just numbers and logic?
It looks at the board entirely devoid of morality or patriotism, asking only one question. Structurally, what is the logical incentive for a system to inflate the numbers?
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. I have to challenge the premise of the author's experiment.
Okay, let's hear the counter-argument.
I understand the appeal of a purely logical, totally detached breakdown of human conflict. But can an AI ever truly be free of human bias?
It's the big debate right now.
I mean, Grok 4, like all large language models, was trained on vast, unimaginable oceans of heavily biased human data. The internet is its foundational brain.
Right, and the internet is full of bias.
Exactly. So even if you explicitly prompt it to use first principles and avoid conventional wisdom, isn't its very understanding of logic, power, and war inherently shaped by the billions of biased human texts, propaganda pieces, and opinion columns it ingested during its training?
That's a solid point.
Can you really ask a machine built entirely out of human bias to give you an unbiased view of human deception?
It is the defining paradox of artificial intelligence. You're right, the foundational architecture of the AI's knowledge is built on human output, which is undeniably subjective.
So how does the experiment hold up?
Well, the mechanism of the specific prompt used here is what makes it valid. When you instruct a highly advanced model to operate strictly from first principles,
Which means what exactly in this context?
it means breaking a complex problem down into its most basic foundational truths that cannot be deduced any further.
Okay.
So when you do that, you are forcing it to bypass the superficial narrative layer of its training data and access the deep structural layer.
Interesting.
It knows all the partisan talking points, certainly, but the prompt acts as a filter, ordering it to ignore the rhetoric and map only the raw mechanics of incentive.
So it's not perfect, but it's better than a human pundit.
Right. It might not be perfectly pristine, but it is capable of a level of structural detachment that a human whose career, social standing, and identity depend on adhering to specific institutional narratives simply cannot achieve.
Okay, so it's a structural diagnostic tool then.
Yep.
Let's look at the diagnostic output this detached logic produced. The AI generated a comprehensive breakdown of why this massive exaggeration occurs, mapping the life cycle of the psychological operation.
And it gave 10 distinct reasons.
Right. And it starts right at the top of the hierarchy, the motivations of the leaders and institutions directing the conflict.
The war room.
Yeah. The first major driver the AI identifies is the need to project raw power and deter future adversaries.
The AI breaks down deterrence not as a physical reality, but as a broadcast strategy. A broadcast strategy. I like that phrasing.
Yeah. By inflating the body count and the scale of destruction, the messaging signals something very specific to the global community. It signals we have the capacity and the will to inflict massive, one-sided punishment with impunity.
Wow.
And this isn't just about the immediate enemy on the battlefield. It is a broadcast aimed at the broader geopolitical ecosystem.
To scare everyone else. Exactly. The goal is to make allies of that enemy, or potential opportunistic copycats. The text specifically mentions actors like China or Russian proxies recalculate their own risk assessments before escalating entirely separate conflicts.
So even if the actual physical numbers are relatively modest on a historical wartime scale, you intentionally inflate the narrative so the rest of the world perceives you as an absolute, unrestrained juggernaut.
Right. It's about creating an aura of overwhelming lethality.
And that leads directly into the AI's next point regarding the top of the chain, which involves domestic political capital and leader branding.
Reason number 2.
Right. The AI suggests that leaders actively convert these visible, exaggerated enemy losses into personal brand strength.
And this is where the source text brings up a specific example.
Yes, citing the author's claim about Donald Trump using rhetoric about how mercilessly he targeted adversaries.
And keeping our impartiality disclaimer firmly in place here?
Yes, absolutely. We are just analyzing the dynamic. The AI uses this style of political rhetoric to illustrate how exaggeration transforms a tactical, limited military operation into a mythic, personal victory narrative.
It rallies the domestic political base.
Exactly. It justifies controversial past decisions, and it builds immense political leverage for future budget requests or upcoming elections.
Let's analyze the deep cognitive mechanics of deterrence and political branding here, because they are fundamentally linked.
That's so.
Deterrence, at its core, is purely a psychological construct. It exists entirely in the mind of your adversary.
Not in the actual missiles you have.
Right.
Yeah.
Your actual physical military capability is surprisingly secondary to what your adversary believes your capability to be.
Oh, that makes sense.
If a military strikes and kills 3,000 enemy combatants, but the strategic communications apparatus successfully convinces the global community that they killed 300,000 without even straining their resources.
The deterrent effect moving forward is based entirely on the 300,000 number.
Exactly. The illusion becomes the operational reality.
That's wild.
And domestically, the mechanism is the exact same. A political leader rarely benefits from reporting a messy, complex, highly nuanced, limited engagement.
Because the domestic public doesn't rally around nuance.
No, they rally around decisive, crushing triumph. The brand requires the inflation.
So, what does this all mean? Think about it like a high-stakes poker game.
Okay, I'm following.
You don't actually need to have a royal flush, right? You just need to aggressively convince everyone else at the table that you hold an unbeatable hand so they fold before the cards are shown.
That's a perfect analogy.
If a massive hedge fund wants to short a stock and drive the price down, they don't just quietly sell their shares, they loudly broadcast their position.
They go on financial news networks.
Exactly. They declare the target company is completely worthless, doomed to bankruptcy. They inflate the threat.
They don't actually need the company to be bankrupt today.
Right, they just need the rest of the market to believe the massive, terrifying narrative. If the market believes the bluff, other investors panic and sell, and the hedge fund wins the physical capital based on an engineered psychological panic.
The PSYOP is the broadcasted bluff.
Yes, the inflated casualty numbers are the massive short position pushed into the center of the geopolitical table.
And in international geopolitics, folding to that bluff means a nation backing down from a territorial claim, cutting off funding to a proxy militia, or coming to the negotiating table on highly unfavorable terms.
Without a single shot being fired.
Right. The psychological illusion of massive violence saves the acting nation. The actual physical, economic, and human cost of having to fight a protracted, bloody war to prove their strength.
But, the bluff doesn't just happen at the macro leader-to-leader level.
No, it has to go deeper.
For the illusion to hold weight, this narrative has to be weaponized to manipulate the masses on both sides of the front line. You have to manage the psychology of the populations actually fighting the war.
Which brings us to the next reasons the AI generated.
Right. The AI transitions from the war room to the home front, identifying morale amplification as the third crucial pillar.
The AI points out a fundamental historical truth about human conflict. Civilian populations tire of long wars.
Very quickly.
Yes. The economic drain, the inflation, the troop deployments, the constant hum of low-level anxiety, it grinds a society down.
It's exhausting.
So inflating the damage inflicted on the enemy creates an artificial sense of decisive momentum. It manufactures the feeling that we're winning big and the end is near.
A psychological painkiller.
Exactly. This illusion of rapid, massive, systemic success is the precise mechanism that sustains public tolerance for the ongoing, grinding reality of the operations.
Because if they knew it was a stalemate,
Without that inflated narrative acting as a psychological painkiller, the public would inevitably push back, protest, and demand an end to the conflict.
right. And while the apparatus is pumping a psychological painkiller into its own population, it is simultaneously trying to inject psychological poison into the enemy's population.
Reason number 4.
Yeah. The AI identifies enemy demoralization and internal fracture as the mirror image of morale amplification.
Overstating the death toll deliberately sows deep despair among the adversary's civilian population and their military ranks.
Even if the real number is just 3,000.
Exactly. Creating the perception of truly catastrophic systemic losses is designed to break the fundamental social contract.
Explain that social contract part.
Well, that concept of the social contract is vital here. In any nation, citizens implicitly agree to obey the state and endure hardships with the understanding that the state will ultimately protect them.
Right. That's the deal.
But when a PSYOP successfully convinces an enemy population that their state's military is being slaughtered by the hundreds of thousands, it shatters that trust.
It tells them they're unprotected.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It communicates that the state can no longer protect its people. This specific type of despair accelerates desertions from the armed forces, sparks anti-government civilian protests, and puts immense internal pressure on the enemy leadership to capitulate.
This raises an important question, though. The sheer complexity of that information warfare is staggering when you look at it mechanically.
How so?
Think about the delicate, almost contradictory balancing act these competing war machines have to sustain. As a nation-state conducting a modern war, you have to simultaneously broadcast two entirely different, mutually exclusive realities using the exact same data points.
Oh, I see what you mean.
To your own people, you must project an image of an unstoppable, highly competent force executing righteous victory with minimal risk to yourselves.
Right.
But to the enemy population, you must project the image of a terrifying, unrestrained, overwhelmingly destructive force that is utterly crushing them into dust.
You are manipulating the cognitive frameworks of two entirely different cultures at once.
Requiring incredibly sophisticated segmentation of information.
It really requires total dominance over the information flow. But, I do think we need to examine a potential flaw in the AI's logic regarding that demoralization tactic.
I was thinking the exact same thing. Sowing despair sounds effective in a textbook, but doesn't drastically overstating enemy casualties risk creating the exact opposite effect on the ground?
The cornered animal effect.
Exactly. If an enemy population truly believes they are being indiscriminately slaughtered by the hundreds of thousands, doesn't that breed a sense of profound existential dread?
It definitely could.
Rather than simply giving up and deserting, wouldn't they fight 10 times harder out of pure desperation and a desire for absolute revenge?
They'd feel like they have no other choice.
Right. If you successfully convince a population they have absolutely nothing left to lose, don't you inadvertently forge them into the most dangerous, uncompromising adversaries imaginable?
It's the ultimate gamble in psychological operations, and history provides conflicting data points on this.
Such as?
Well, you are highlighting the cognitive difference between a war of attrition and a war of annihilation.
Okay.
If a targeted population believes they are simply losing a geopolitical struggle over borders or resources, the despair tactic might work. They might surrender to preserve their lives and property.
Because they still have a future.
Right. But if the PSYOP pushes the narrative too far and they believe they are facing total systemic annihilation, which is exactly what grossly exaggerated apocalyptic casualty numbers imply, they will often dig in and fight to the last person.
Has that happened before?
Absolutely. Look at the strategic bombing campaigns of World War II. The intention was to bomb the enemy populations into submission. But in many cases, the shared trauma only hardened their resolve.
It backfired.
However, the AI's logic here is likely focused on the immediate short-term disruption of command and control.
Oh, meaning like right there on the battlefield.
Exactly. If an algorithmic PSYOP can convince frontline troops that their entire support battalion has just been wiped out, immediate panic sets in before the long-term existential resolve has time to form.
So it's a dangerous game of psychological timing.
Precisely.
Okay, let's follow the timeline of the operation. We've established the leaders puffing their chests and the populations being emotionally manipulated.
Right.
But sustaining morale and causing panic are purely psychological states. How do these institutions maintain the actual physical momentum of the conflict?
Because war isn't just emotion.
No, it's logistics. It's incredibly expensive. It requires a constant flow of capital and weaponry.
And that leads to reason 5.
The AI maps this by identifying the need to justify escalation and sustain operations.
The structural logic here is remarkably cynical but perfectly sound.
Walk me through it.
The AI posits that if the public has been conditioned to believe the enemy has already suffered devastating, historically massive blows, yet that enemy somehow continues to launch attacks or pose a threat,
It creates a cognitive dissonance.
it creates a unique psychological loophole for the military apparatus. It becomes exponentially easier for military leaders to argue for more aggressive rules of engagement, expanded target lists, or drastically increased defense funding.
Because the cognitive framing presented to the public becomes, look, we hit them with everything we have, we inflicted massive catastrophic damage, and they are still coming at us.
They must be irrational.
They are unstoppable unless we take the gloves completely off. It's a brilliant manipulative trick.
It really is.
It transforms offensive military escalation into an act of reluctant, necessary defense.
But for that specific, nuanced narrative to reach and saturate the public consciousness, the military needs a massive delivery mechanism.
And that brings us to the most fascinating and perhaps the most indicted layer in this entire analysis: the media.
Reason number 6.
The AI points directly to media business model incentives as a primary driver of the exaggeration.
This is where the AI's first principles analysis truly shines a light on the structural realities of modern information distribution.
Because it's completely detached from politics.
Exactly. The AI notes, devoid of any moral judgment, that framing a conflict as a story of catastrophic losses, massive retaliatory strikes, and a historic humanitarian disaster fundamentally drives user engagement.
It drives television ratings.
It drives clicks on web articles.
It keeps users doom scrolling on social media platforms, which in turn drives ad revenue.
A narrative of massive destruction achieves this financial goal far more effectively than reporting the mundane reality.
Which might be a localized, highly limited exchange with minimal casualties.
Right. Media outlets, regardless of their political alignment on the spectrum, are all competing ruthlessly in the same attention economy.
So structurally, they gravitate toward the most emotionally charged, high arousal narrative available.
Because high arousal equals high retention.
You know, when people discuss the relationship between the military and the media, it's so easy to slip into conspiracy theories.
It really is.
It's easy to picture a smoky back room where 4-star generals and cable news executives are secretly shaking hands, smoking cigars, and conspiring to lie to the public.
Like a movie plot.
Right. But what the AI's analysis suggests is actually far more disturbing because it's completely mundane. There is no smoky back room. There doesn't need to be.
Precisely. It is an examination of a symbiotic, structurally aligned relationship. The media ecosystem isn't necessarily consciously colluding with the military to execute a psychological operation.
No, they're just doing their jobs.
Right, their own independent corporate financial incentives, chasing metrics, maximizing user time on site, delivering value to shareholders, naturally align perfectly with the military's strategic goal of inflating the scale and stakes of the conflict.
The military apparatus wants the population terrified, awed, and engaged, so they will support the war effort and the defense budget.
And the media apparatus wants the population terrified, awed, and engaged, so they won't change the channel or close the app.
The motives are entirely different, but the required output, a sensationalized, exaggerated narrative of catastrophic violence, is identical.
That's spot on.
I think of it like an algorithmic engagement loop functioning as a massive attention harvesting machine.
A machine.
Yeah. This machine is designed to automatically filter out nuance, context, and proportionality. It inherently isolates and amplifies only the most dramatic, terrifying, high-stakes data points.
And why does it do that?
Because in a digital world of literally infinite content choices, primal fear and profound outrage are the only cognitive stimuli powerful enough to make a human being stop scrolling and pay attention.
Right.
So when the military provides a narrative that is even slightly exaggerated, this algorithmic machine ingests it and instantly turns it up to a deafening volume.
Not as part of a shadowy military plot.
Exactly. Simply because the algorithm is programmed to find the most efficient way to sell soap during the commercial break.
And this brings us to a critical juncture in the AI's logic.
Okay, what's next?
Once that attention harvesting machine is blaring at full volume, once that dramatic apocalyptic narrative has fully saturated the global culture, how do the architects of the PSYOP protect the illusion?
Right, because someone is going to check the math eventually.
Exactly. How do they prevent some independent data analyst or an objective journalist from simply publishing the actual much lower numbers and ruining the entire operation?
The AI maps this defensive mechanism as narrative dominance and the suppression of counter-narratives. Reason number 7.
The logic is that by initially setting the scale of the conflict astronomically high at tens or hundreds of thousands, the apparatus effectively builds an impenetrable cognitive fortress around the story.
How does it protect it, though?
Because once that massive anchor number is established in the public mind, any subsequent reporting of lower accurate figures, like the 3,000 number the author cited, can be instantly and aggressively dismissed.
It creates an environment where the truth itself is framed as malicious.
Exactly.
The AI points out that reporting the accurate lower numbers will be reflexively labeled by the dominant culture as denialism. It will be framed as enemy propaganda designed to minimize the suffering.
Furthermore, this tactic intentionally crowds out all broader context.
It specifically relates back to the author's initial comparison to child mortality, doesn't it?
It does. If the public's cognitive bandwidth is entirely consumed by the urgent, sensationalized catastrophe of hundreds of thousands of war dead, they have absolutely zero emotional bandwidth left to consider the 20,000 children dying daily from poverty.
The dominant loud story suppresses all other realities simply by taking up all the available space in the room.
It's cognitive crowding.
But we have to ask why the human brain is so completely susceptible to this specific trick.
It is a profound vulnerability.
Why doesn't the public, possessing the entirety of human knowledge on the phones in their pockets, demand empirical proof of these massive numbers?
The AI answers this by identifying the exploitation of psychological asymmetry. Reason 8.
Okay, break down psychological asymmetry.
The AI deduces that modern global audiences have been conditioned over decades to subconsciously expect high body counts.
Conditioned by what?
Media, movies, historical narratives. Understating the inflicted damage or reporting a surprisingly low casualty figure risks making a highly funded military look weak or incompetent.
So exaggeration perfectly aligns with what we have been culturally programmed to expect 21st century conflict to look like.
Exactly. We really need to unpack the underlying psychology here, specifically the cognitive heuristic known as anchoring bias.
Right, because it is the linchpin of this entire vulnerability.
It is. Anchoring bias is a well-documented phenomenon where human beings rely far too heavily on the first piece of information they receive, the anchor, when making subsequent decisions or judgments.
Like Kahneman and Tversky's work.
Yes, the pioneer psychologists prove this repeatedly. If a system drops an initial anchor in the public consciousness that says hundreds of thousands dead, that enormous figure immediately becomes the baseline for reality.
The brain calibrates to it.
It locks onto it. So, a month later, when the true verified number of 3,000 is finally presented, it is so far away from the initial anchor that the human brain instinctively rejects it.
It feels wrong.
The truth seems absurdly, suspiciously low. We actively fight against the factual reality because the sensationalized lie feels more consistent with the emotional anchor we've already accepted.
I want to address you listening right now. Think about the media we consume. Think about the last blockbuster movie you watched.
Sweeping aerial shots.
Right. Entire cities reduced to smoking rubble, the endless deafening waves of explosions, the dramatic orchestral scores playing over mass destruction.
We have been culturally conditioned to expect cinematic, world-ending destruction when we hear the word war.
Are we actually imposing Hollywood-level aesthetic expectations onto real-world, localized, regional conflicts?
It certainly seems that way.
It seems like we are effectively forcing our political and military leaders to lie to us, because if they told us the mundane truth, that it was a limited, highly calculated exchange with 3,000 casualties, we would feel vaguely disappointed by the reality of war.
Disappointed that it's not a movie?
Right. It wouldn't match the movie in our heads. Are we, as a public, essentially demanding the spectacle?
That is a profoundly disturbing realization. We have gamified and cinematicized the concept of human conflict to such an extreme degree that a precise, limited military strike feels anticlimactic to a populace raised on digital explosions.
Anticlimactic.
Think about it. If a modern leader wants to be perceived as a historic, powerful figure, they cannot be seen overseeing a minor skirmish or a contained tactical exchange.
It'd look weak.
They must position themselves as the protagonist of an epic, world-altering struggle. The public's subconscious demand for narrative satisfaction, for a story that matches the scale of the movies they watch, absolutely drives the inflation of the stakes.
The military apparatus provides the lie, but we are deeply complicit co-conspirators in our own deception because we crave the drama.
That's exactly it.
That is heavy. Okay, let's pull the analytical lens all the way back.
We have a picture.
Yeah. We've traced this from the leaders projecting power down to the manipulation of domestic and enemy morale, through the algorithmic amplification of the media, and into the very biases of our own brains.
And we still have 2 reasons left.
Right. Finally, the AI's deep dive expands outward from the localized conflict zone back to the macro geopolitical stage, and then right back into the center of our own domestic living rooms.
The next logical pillar the AI identifies is coalition building and international signaling. Reason 9.
Moving beyond mere deterrence, right?
Exactly. The AI states that allies, proxy groups, and notably unaligned fence-sitting nations are inherently more likely to back or at least refuse to actively oppose the side that appears overwhelmingly dominant.
In the brutal, pragmatic calculus of international relations, nations want to bet on the winning horse.
Obviously. Inflated casualty numbers and exaggerated narratives of destruction make a military campaign look like an unstoppable tidal wave of historic power.
Rather than a contained, messy, back-and-forth tit-for-tat exchange where the ultimate outcome remains uncertain.
It's the ultimate geopolitical bandwagon effect.
Nations want to align with gravity.
They do.
And finally, we arrive at the culmination of the AI's logic. Reason 10. This brings the entire complex argument full circle.
The ultimate utility of the PSYOP.
Yes, the AI identifies the ultimate utility as distraction and relative framing.
The logic here is that continuously highlighting catastrophic enemy losses shifts the domestic focus entirely away from internal systemic problems.
It deliberately overloads the cognitive bandwidth of the public.
Right, to distract them from domestic policy failures, severe economic struggles, the actual financial costs of the war itself, casualties on their own side.
Or, and the AI explicitly notes this, perfectly echoing the author's initial premise, the broader global indifference to massive preventable tragedies like the 20,000 children dying of poverty every single day.
It all connects back to that. If we synthesize this entire life cycle, what we are looking at is the ultimate function of information warfare.
Which is?
It is not simply about winning a physical battle over a piece of land. It is about the pursuit of absolute control over perception.
Control.
It's about controlling international alliances through the grand, projected illusion of military supremacy. And crucially, it is about controlling domestic political stability through the precise algorithmic engineering of outrage and awe.
By completely reframing a regional, limited conflict as a righteous, high-stakes, apocalyptic moral drama, a state apparatus can successfully paper over immense domestic failures.
It's a perfect cover.
We mentioned the sensory bottleneck earlier, the idea of cognitive RAM being overloaded. Think of the state apparatus not as a magician pulling a rabbit out of a hat, but as a system administrator managing a server, the server being the public consciousness.
I like this analogy.
The server only has so much processing power. The state has massive systemic errors occurring in the background programs, failing infrastructure, economic inflation, poverty, the 7 million children.
The things they don't want you to see.
Right. If the public focuses on those errors, the system administrators lose their jobs or worse. So the administrators intentionally launch a massive resource-heavy, high-priority program right on the desktop.
That program is the sensationalized war.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It requires 99% of the server's processing power just to render the terrifying loud graphics. The system is so bogged down processing the fear of the war that it literally cannot load the data about the failing infrastructure or the poverty deaths.
The distraction isn't just a byproduct. It is a vital engineered feature of the system's survival.
The cognitive overload is the point.
It absolutely is. To bringing this entire discussion back to the AI's concluding insight on the mechanics of information warfare, the AI summarizes its own output with chilling clarity.
What does it conclude?
It explicitly states that these underlying motives, deterrence, branding, morale, media incentives, distraction, are not mutually exclusive.
They don't take turns.
No, they do not operate in a vacuum, nor do they wait in line. They are running simultaneously.
It is a symphony of manipulation.
Yes, and they operate harmoniously across completely different sectors of society. You have politicians seeking votes, generals seeking deterrence and funding, and media executives seeking algorithmic engagement.
All inadvertently or intentionally working together to inflate the exact same set of numbers.
The central thesis the AI derives is profound. The perception of scale matters far, far more than raw physical numbers in shaping human behavior.
Whether this massive exaggeration is a highly cynical, carefully calculated plot orchestrated in a hidden war room,
Or merely an emergent, inevitable property of institutional greed and human cognitive bias colliding.
the result is identical. It fits the classic definition of wartime information operations.
If you can control the perceived scale of the victory or the threat, you control the behavior of your citizens, your allies, and your enemies.
So we've taken this incredibly deep journey through the AI's cold logic.
We covered a lot of ground.
We've seen how geopolitical power projection, political branding, the fragility of morale, the algorithmic incentives of the media, and our own deeply ingrained psychological biases all intertwine to drastically inflate the scale of war in our minds.
It's all connected.
We've seen how easy it is to make us blind to 7 million deaths by terrifying us with 3,000.
The primary defense against this level of sophisticated cognitive manipulation is rigorous critical thinking.
It's the only way.
The source material, by using an AI to strip away the emotional rhetoric and the cinematic expectations we bring to the table, forces us to look at the bare skeletal structure of propaganda.
It's bones.
Actively questioning the scale of what we are told, recognizing our own anchoring biases, fighting our demand for Hollywood spectacle, and constantly asking who benefits from this specific narrative being so massive.
Cui bono?
Right. That is our best and perhaps our only defense against the overwhelming tide of information warfare we face every time we look at a screen.
Question everything, especially the numbers that make you feel the most profound sense of awe or outrage.
Definitely.
Before we wrap up, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. Something that builds on this entire experiment we just analyzed, but pushes it one terrifying step further into the future.
This should be good.
We've just spent the last hour marveling at how perfectly, how coldly, and how accurately this AI model was able to deconstruct human psychological operations from first principles.
It provided a remarkably insightful diagnostic output of human vulnerability.
It mapped our cognate biases, our media structures, and our geopolitical bluffs flawlessly.
Right.
But if an AI model can so easily and perfectly analyze and deconstruct our psychological vulnerabilities, what happens when these exact same incredibly advanced AI models are utilized by militaries, intelligence agencies, and political operatives to generate the psychological operations instead of just analyzing them in a vacuum?
That is a terrifying prospect.
Think about it. If a system like Grok 4 knows exactly which cognitive buttons to push to make us implicitly believe an exaggerated casualty count, how long until an AI is autonomously writing the press releases, generating the photorealistic fake footage, and perfectly calculating the exact linguistic phrasing needed to bypass our critical thinking entirely?
It would be almost impossible to detect.
How will we ever be able to tell what's real when the misdirection and the cognitive overload aren't coming from a flawed, transparently biased human pundit, but are flawlessly calculated by a machine that understands our biological sensory bottlenecks better than we understand them ourselves?
We are rapidly transitioning from an era of human-engineered perception to an era of algorithmically optimized, bespoke reality. The AI won't just know the bluff. It will know exactly how much you, personally, are willing to bet before you fold.
Something to keep you awake tonight. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We know your time is incredibly valuable, and we appreciate you spending it with us, exploring the complex, often manipulated mechanics of how we understand the world around us. Keep questioning the scale, keep digging for the first principles, and we will catch you next time.